Salutations everyone! Today's video will be revolving around Seidr Laboratories. Now you might have noticed in the past few videos that I've been doing this format where I center a playthrough video around a single terminal directive card. I realize I haven't actually formally introduced this format, so I thought of doing this format as opposed to the typical pack review that I usually do, which I think is a refreshing change. Instead of the typical theory crafting that most podcasts or video channels do with new cards, instead I'll do a more practical analysis of cards based on how I felt playing them during a playthrough. So today's video will be centered around Seidr Laboratories, and we shall see what it does. First, let's look at its drawbacks. The recursion adds a card from archives to your R&D instead of your hand, and this is actually quite a fair downside because you lose a click having to draw that card in your hand before you play it. Now usually you end up mandatorily drawing this card, so it doesn't feel like you're losing a click, but instead of mandatorily drawing a new fresh card from your deck, which allows you to advance your game and see more agendas, more win cons, more money, you are drawing this card that you recurred from the bin. So you're not necessarily advancing through your deck, which could be a downside. Another important downside is that this doesn't do as much early game as some other HB identities do, like Nick's Design, or even ETF, which gives you the steady 1 credit stream. Seidr is blank until you activate archives with useful cards. Finally, it's worth noting that this is not ETF, and this is always the big problem plaguing HB identities. That being said, Seidr is still pretty powerful for a non-ETF ID, and we'll see it this game. But first, let's see some ways in which we can trigger Seidr. There are 3 main ways which you can do this. I've split them into 3 main categories. Passive punishers in the form of defensive upgrades or assets that cause the opponent to lose clicks whenever they do something to threaten your board state. Mason Bellamy and Ronnie 5 are examples of this. Then you have active click losses, the only one of which I can think of is False Lead. This allows you to force your opponent to lose clicks during a run. And is the only form of click loss that you can proactively trigger as the call. Finally, there's Ice. That is split into 2 categories itself. You have forced click losses like Enigma and Tapestry, and you have Bioroids, which the runner can, on their own volition, click through. This makes Bioroids very interesting because it increases their face check punishment. And because of this, I'll be playing around these cards, just the Ice, in this Seidr deck. I'm not going to be playing passive or active click losses and punishers. I'm simply going to spam a bunch of Bioroids and click loss Ice, and we'll see how things go. So, enjoy the playthrough. Let's see how Seidr fares. Would you mulligan this opening hand? Pause the video and have a think before we move on. Now, even though it has a piece of good ice that you can put on HQ, unfortunately it's rather poor. It takes me a lot of credits to click up for IPO, and Adonis doesn't have the corresponding end run ice to protect it on a remote. Hence I'm inclined to mulligan it, and I get a very rich hand. Hedge Fund, IPO, Restructure, Adonis. Something's missing. Where's my ice? I better draw some ice on my first draw, and no I don't. So rather than risk taking 1 draw, I instead decide to play Hedge IPO and then install the sands in here. The reason is this. If I get double siphon here, this would be a very horrible outcome for me. And I would like to have some way to absorb the siphon credits, and tossing down the sands in seems like the best way to do so. Another important point to note is that this might distract my opponent into running server 1, which would allow me to buy some time to get some ice going on HQ. Meanwhile, my opponent steals a food from hand, and I do draw into ice, so thank goodness for that. Yeah, so I was very vulnerable to a count siphon, but thankfully my opponent didn't start with any despite beginning with 9 cards, so I dodged a huge bullet right there. Another thing to note is that even though another reason why I wanted to get to IPO so bad was because if my opponent had siphon, I did not want to go below the IPO threshold. The worst thing is sitting with an IPO in your hand and not being able to play it. Unfortunately, protecting HQ here comes with a big cost. I concede the second agenda very quickly. So now my opponent's on 4 points, and I'm on 0. I have a lot of money, but I'm barely getting started. I have a very hard time deciding what ice to put on R&D here. Both are equally as good, but ultimately I decided to go for the hard and the run on R&D. The reason why I wanted Vikram on R&D is because I wanted to save the Eli for the remote so that I can drop an Adonis in there. Vikram on the base of a server is additionally not very good, which is why I decided to stick with the Eli instead. Now I draw into Itchy, which is a very good second ice. You don't want Itchy to be at the base of a server, but as an outer ice, as you know, to trash your opponent's programs before they hit the innermost and the run, it's pretty good. Now I draw into a second Vikram, so now I can definitely put the second Vikram R&D. So this is a very secure, these are very secure centrals, which is very important. That's my first priority, playing up against someone who is up 4 points to 0 against me. Next order of business, further defending my centrals with upgrades. I drew both of my Crisium grids, so they're immediately going on my centrals, 1 on each. Normally, against Andromeda, you don't need Crisium on R&D, but better safe than sorry here. I do not want a Rogue indexing into Mad Dash cost me the game. So an upgrade on each should save my bacon. My opponent goes for a Temujin. They finally drew the Temujin. It seems like my opponent had equally as much of a bad starting hand as I did. No Siphon, no Temujin. By the time they found the Temujin, I had found all the ice needed to keep them out of centrals. They did click through my Vikram to get their first Temujin tick, and noticed that I was not able to trigger Seidr as a result of Employee Strike being active. You bet if I find a 3-2 agenda that I'm going to fast advance it with Biotic Labor to rid of the Employee Strike. That is one of my priorities right now that all the centrals are locked down. Just a quick note here, even though I'm not getting my Seidr trigger, this Vikram on Archives is still doing a lot of work. So my opponent just spent 3 clicks to get through the Vikram just to get their sec testing, their Temujin money. That's 5 credits. 3 clicks for 5 credits. I'm happy for them to liberate their whole Temujin if it's gonna be that inefficient. Now my opponent pokes my remote thinking that this is an agenda I'm trying to slide through, but no, it's an Architect into an Adonis, so I get a free Architect trigger, and this catapults me into the lead, because this way I can actually see my deck, and I know that the Vitruvius is going to come very, very soon, i.e. the card that's going to turn off the Employee Strike. I want my Seidr back up as soon as possible. After seeing my deck, I install Turing on the remote so as to make the remote super hard for my opponent to get through. That's 5 credits for Gordian Blade, still very taxing. In addition, I cost my opponent an extra 5 credits by recurring the Sansan City grid into the remote. Architect, such a huge tempo swing. 5 credits to break a Turing on the remote, plus 5 credits worth of Sansan money. Trash costs. So that was a very nice swing right there for me. Now I knew the next card would be Adonis, so that immediately goes in the remote, no question. Just waiting a bit here, acting like I'm thinking about it, but there's no question. Adonis straight into the remote. This allows me to gain money while I'm fast advancing my agenda, which I'm going to top deck right about now. What else is there worth noting? Yes, so I was saying Vikram is very powerful, even as a single piece of ice, and in all reality, sentries, Bioroid sentries are really, really good. Even without Seidr's ability, Itchy and Vikram are good against most runners right now. I say most. Smoke is the notable exception. Dagger slices through all these sentries with ease, and that's a very big problem matchup for Seidr and HB in general. But outside of Smoke, you bet that sentries are very nasty to deal with right now. It's very, very ironic that the sentry faction, criminals, have no good answer against these high strength sentries, and Anox are reliant on Mimic Sucker, which you can board with Cyberdex Virus Suite, which I have in my hand right now. But right now I top deck the Vitruvius that I knew was coming, and that gets scored immediately. Now Employee Strike is gone. Even though that means conceding 2 errant counters to my opponent, they don't actually have a Sentry Breaker out, so if they run my Centrals, as they do right here, they're gonna be greeted with a nasty surprise. Sentry that they can't break, unless they trigger Seidr's ability. So yes, click, 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 here we go. What do I recur? There's a bunch of stuff in the bin. The default recur card to recurse Baltic Labor because that's my win condition, and Andromeda has no way to clot my Baltic Labor. However, at this point, I'm about to get siphoned. I'm going to go down to potentially no credits, so I would like some money. How about hedge fund? That's one flaw with this economy suite. When you're running hedge fund IPO restructure, as mentioned from the BABW video I did a while back, a couple of days actually, if you don't have a supporting low range economy card like Beanstalk, Celeb Gift, Sweeps Week, it's going to be really hard to play those the big econ cards because you have to click for credits first. Anyway, I decide to recur hedge fund onto the top of R&D, and then surprise my opponent with the Chrysium Grid. No siphon for you. You can't use your Iron tokens to remove those tags, so no siphon. And I do get to keep my 2 credits, which is huge, as you'll see in a moment's time. So yeah, very risky decision for my opponent to go for a blind siphon. Definitely failed there. And on the last click, they did not have the capacity to contest my Adonis. So the Adonis gave me 3 credits, which then activated my hedge fund. So you see how clutch the Chrysium and Seidr combination is. Chrysium allowed me to dodge the siphon, which allowed me to start my turn with 2 credits, and then the top deck hedge fund allowed me to burst up to 10 credits after being so-called siphoned down to 2 credits. So Adonis doing a lot of work, Chrysium doing a lot of work, Seidr Laboratories pulling its weight right there. So now I know that I do have a Vitruvius in my hand, but no Baltic Labor to go with it. I would have a Baltic Labor if I recurred Baltic Labor with Seidr Labs, but as I mentioned earlier, economy was more important at this point for me than Baltic Labor. But no worries, I draw into a Violet level clearance, so this is about to solve all my problems. I play the Jackson so that I can pitch the Generals if I get flooded, and then I play a CVS on HQ. This is masquerading as a Chrysium Grid. I know CVS is irrelevant in this matchup, so why not use it to double up as a fake upgrade? If I am able to force my opponent to run through HQ once just to clear the so-called Chrysium Grid, I'm winning. My opponent runs my Jackson here, and I'm deciding whether to use the Jackson or not. This deck doesn't actually run Friends in High Places because I'm banking on this, or I'm not say banking, but my only recursion is the Seidr recursion itself. So I'm looking at my bin and I'm going, okay, I could use some economy cards. Okay, here's a very important thing about playing with Seidr. Do not use Jackson to shuffle in important cards back in your deck. I shuffle a Baltic Labor here, and this could be a problem for me. If my opponent triggers Seidr on a later turn, I won't have the Baltic Labor to fast advance with. Or rather, when I trigger Seidr, I'll look at my bin and I go, oh wait, the Baltic is gone because I shuffle it back to R&D. Basically what I'm trying to say is, make sure you leave some important cards left in archive so that you can recur them with Seidr in the event your opponent triggers them. In this case, it didn't really matter because firstly, there was a Sansan in the bin. So if I wanted to go for a fast advance card, I could recur Sansan. Secondly, as you saw, I was able to taken my R&D with more Baltic Labors, and as such, I immediately top decked the Baltic next turn. You notice I didn't immediately score the Vitruvius. As a general rule, against criminals, you do not want to aggressively score. Criminals are better than you in the mid to early game, early to mid game, and you do not want to concede the early advantage and let them snowball out of control. You'd rather total up, get some ice going, and make sure they have no chance of assaulting you. So this is why I decided to fortify HQ with more ice in case my opponent decides to hit HQ, which is very likely. If they're running cards like Legwork and Siphon, they will find a way to get into HQ to trash the Chrysium Grid, or what seems like Chrysium Grid. So this is why I'm quite paranoid about HQ defense. Now my HQ is adequately secured with one of each ice, a tapestry on the outside, code gate, an Eli on the inside, a barrier, and a sentry in the middle. The Ichi. The criminal matchup is quite interesting. It's one of the few matchups where you actually want to stack sentries. Because they typically run Mongoose, so if you stack 2 Ichis, they'll be forced to click through one, which triggers Seidr. In this game, I was not able to stack sentries, but I did the next best thing, which was to spread my code gates out across all servers. This meant that my opponent would be forced to pump Gordian Blade no matter which server they ran, meaning a high credit investment for them. Okay, now as I said, criminals are usually bad in the early game, but my opponent's making an exception here. Once KD Jones hits the table, you have to be aware that you're on the timer, because KD Jones can get very out of hand very quickly. I need to start trying to close out this game. I cannot drag this game on for too long, because otherwise my opponent will have more than enough credits to find the last few agendas. Do note that they are still very close to winning because of my poor early start. I now managed to equalize the scoreline 4-4, and my opponent now needs to make something happen. With this deck, I have two ways of winning. I can either go all out fast advance by scoring 4 2-pointer agendas, or I could go for the standard 2-2-3 agenda suite by trying to find my last copy of Global Food in the deck and trying to score it some way. This is going to be very hard against Andromeda, and not to mention that I only have 1 copy of food left in my deck, my opponent's having stolen 2 of them. So it seems quite likely at this point that given that I have a lot of fast advance left in my deck and 2 Jacksons to work with, I think I'm going for the fast advance route. Now my opponent pokes R&D. Vikram is going to cause a huge pain for my opponents. Most Andromeda players at this point would click through the Vikram. My opponent does not really have that option, because if they allow me to recur Baltic on the top of my deck, not only is their run going to waste, they are not going to get an agenda from a single R&D run if I'm top decking a non-agenda. More importantly, they will give me my win condition. So my opponent was basically forced to spend 7 credits on Mongoose right there. Or was it 6? 6 credits on Mongoose to break the Vikram. 4 credits to break the Eli, only to see Chrysium Grid again. Trash again. My opponent's down to 2 credits. Well. That is so painful for Andromeda to go down to 2 credits. Now, if I had a Global Food in my hand, this might seem like a prime opportunity to score it, but keep in mind that my opponent does have KD Jones loaded up, 6 credits and 4 in bank, so scoring out a Global Food is not really an option at this point, even if I had one. But now my R&D is pretty secure, and my opponent's pretty broke, so let's see what I can make happen. I have a restructure in my hand, so that's first priority. I'm definitely going to play the restructure at least. What's my last click? I'm going to take a credit. I think credits are going to be very important, because right now I'm aiming for a win on 4 agendas with pure fast advance. So as such, each fast advance costs 7 credits because I'm not ETF. Baltic Labor into a 3-2 costs 7 credits. It's going to be very expensive, considering that I still need to protect my remote server and my HQ. My opponent continues running through Vikram, and actually clicks through the Vikram, so I do get to recur something with Seidr here. I have lots of choices here. Chrysium Grid seems like the most obvious choice, but I'm thinking of winning the game right now. And as I said earlier, because prolonging a game is only to my disadvantage, because KD Jones will get out of hand. My opponent can just total up and wait for me to get to match point before assaulting me with KD money. So I needed to find a way to win quickly, and Violet level clearance is how you win quickly. With Violet level, I'm able to dig through my deck very rapidly for both the agenda and the Baltic Labor I need to win. If I had the agenda but no Baltic Labor, it would make more sense for me to recur Baltic Labor. But since I needed both pieces, VLC seems like the perfect card of choice. Dig through my deck and give me some money at the same time. And boy, did I get a very good Violet level off the back of that. Biotic, ABT, Biotic. Perfect. So next turn is going to be score ABT unless circumstances dictate otherwise, and the bonus is because I have a Jackson in the remote, I can even fire ABT to get me more eyes to tide me over to the last agenda score. This should be really interesting. My opponent's running out of options quickly, but they do have one last burst of money in the KD Jones. Let's see how they're going to find their win. At this point, I'm really afraid of a HQ assault. That would drain a lot of money, but instead my opponent shows intent on R&D with a Fem and an Temujin direct on R&D. So suddenly, this server, which used to cost 10 to break, now only costs 6 to break. Temujin offsets 4 credits, Desperado offsets 1 credit, and my opponent gets an ABT off the back of that, bringing them up to match point. Suddenly, I'm in a tenuous situation again. What seemed like a clear route to victory for me with double Baltic in hand is now a very dangerous situation. I need to fix the situation immediately, and as I said earlier, even though I intended to score the ABT, certain unforeseen circumstances might arise, and this is exactly one of them. I was forced to spend a turn shoring up R&D defenses. I'm not going to override the Vikram, it's still going to tax the fam out quite a bit. I want a Fairchild 3 on R&D to tax the Gordium Blade. Now I really truly do have code gates on every single server. That Fairchild 3 is going to add 7 credits to the break cost of R&D, rendering it practically unfeasible for my opponent to go through. So this is great. I have enough money to res my R&D defenses, HQ defenses, and still have some change left over to advance a Biotic. Now my opponent, this is very reminiscent of old school Criminal once again. When you get to the mid-late game, they get locked out. They just don't have enough money to run through repeatedly. Temujin's completely locked out. My opponent is starving. They need at least a couple more turns to get KD up back to speed before they can start hammering R&D once again. Chances are my opponent does have a medium in their hand and really wanted to win on R&D. So, as I said, that KD Jones is going to tick down. I need to win before my opponent finds enough KD money. So I'm going to trigger the ABT here. And we are now tied 6-6. This is a very close battle, down to the wire. Who is going to win? I have the win in sight. It's in my hand. Biotic Vitruvius for the win. But if my opponent catches on, I could be in a lot of trouble. Because a single HQ run will give my opponent 1/3 of a shot of winning. This is very scary. HQ looks like the most vulnerable server right now. I'm really hoping my opponent doesn't run HQ here. My opponent has lots of decisions to make. But one big saving grace is that as my opponent reasoned out their line of play in the chat, they told me that the chances of me having the win in hand is rather unlikely, given that there are 2 Biotic labels in the bin already. Now, while my opponent is contemplating their life choices, I want to take the time to talk about how phenomenal Seidr's ability is. Look at R&D right now. In your position as the runner, what you most likely do right now is to Hail Mary run through R&D, hope to top deck the winning agenda, and if you don't, at least R&D is kind of locked. The corp will be forced to pop Jackson to refresh R&D to hopefully top deck the winning agenda, assuming that I don't have the winning agenda in hand, which could have very well been the case. Don't forget, I only top decked the winning Vitruvius just last turn. So you would just Hail Mary run through R&D, and with the few credits my opponent has, probably click through the outermost Fairchild 3. Well, that's not an option, is it? Against Seidr, if you click through any ice at all, I would simply top deck on R&D a random card and just thwart your R&D access completely. The ability for Seidr Laboratories to shut off the Hail Mary R&D run option is such a big advantage of this identity. Furthermore, another immeasurable advantage of playing Seidr Laboratories is forcing your opponent to use icebreakers to break ice as opposed to clicking through them. In a lot of situations, the runner would rather just spend the clicks because the clicks are generally less valuable than the many credits that are spent. Like in this game, for example, my opponent breaking the Vikrams. My opponent did spend a lot of money to break Vikram with Mongoose on one of the R&D runs earlier. In that situation, most runners would usually click through the Vikram, but my opponent had to change up their play, otherwise they would be giving me a free Seidr trigger. And this is a big deal because every time they spend credits instead of clicking, they lose resources. And this is why my opponent's so poor right now. Despite being in the criminal faction, my opponent is poor because they ended up paying a lot more for their early aggression than expected, leaving them with insufficient resources to contest the late game. It's also worth noting that the CVS on HQ play is basically winning me the game right now, because my opponent does have a legwork in hand at this point, but is deterred from playing it because they see the upgrade on HQ. So yeah, her legwork would otherwise have 100% shot of winning my opponent this game, but that's not happening. Instead, my opponent plays Employee Strike and then proceeds through Archives, forcing the Jackson out of me in the hopes that I do not top deck the winning agenda. My opponent hopes to buy one more turn while I dig up for my winning combo, but little did they know that there was no more time to be bought. I had the win in hand. Yeah, Seidr is pretty impressive this game, huh? We saw many of its benefits this game. Let's talk about a few more. So my opponent was forced to play a lot more passively in the early to mid game before they assembled all their breakers. They knew that running on my centrals was not going to be of much benefit. In fact, it could be a huge disaster for them. Uh, One of HB's strongest eyes is Architect, so strong in fact that it's now the only eyes in fact on the most wanted list. Why is that so? Because of its sheer face check punishment value. Unlike any other HB eyes, you can't just spend clicks to get through Architect. Instead, you give the corp a huge tempo advantage. And the same is true for Bioroids in Seidr. Suddenly, your Bioroids are that much more punishing in face check value because not only do you have to spend clicks to get past them, Seidr gets an advantage by recurring hedge fund or whatever card they want. So yeah, that's actually a very big deal. In that sense, you can kind of think Saber Laboratories, the identity, as the HB analog of, say, making news in NBN or Nisei Division in Jinteki, but to a smaller extent. It makes your in-faction eyes better, the Bioroid specifically, because it ups their face check punishment value. In quotation marks. It's a very loose analogy, but it's surprising how true that is. What else does Seidr provide? It makes 1.0 sentries that much better. As I mentioned, your ice becomes souped up, and this especially applies to 1.0 sentries because typically runners often click through sentries because they are so unwieldy to break. Aside from smoke, as mentioned earlier, most runners have a lot of trouble with multi-subs big sentries, and if you tag on Seidr's ability to these sentries, they become a lot less palatable to click through. How many times has someone click traced through your Ichi 1.0? Countless. Vikram is rather irrelevant because the first subroutine, in a Hail Mary run, the first subroutine, you often deal with a Vikram by clicking through the first subroutine and letting the other two fire. 2 brain damage is nothing if you are making a Hail Mary run, and you're at that point, Vikram exists only as a single sub ice, which is not very good. But if you get to recur something with Seidr's ability, it softens the blow for you as the corp. Finally, one thing that I didn't really get to show this game, because my opponent didn't really run my remote, was that early game is super good as something to soup up your remote ice. I'm looking at Turing right here, because most aggressive runners like Wizard are able to run your remote early on, take the face check punishment, usually clicks, and then get to the base of your server and destroy whatever campaign, Sansan Grid, Jeeves is in there. Often this is a net gain for the runner if they are Wizard. However, with Seidr, the equation changes again, because every time Wizard clicks through your remote Turing, you are gaining tempo. So yeah, this could be very useful in against a Shaper or an Anarch matchup when you're trying to stick your early Adonis and convert that money into a win later on. So yeah, Adonis is one of the key cards in Seidr, but I think the biggest key card in Seidr is Biotic Labor. Think about it yourself. When you are tasked with building a Seidr deck, what key cards are you going to recur with Seidr's ability? You have assets, upgrades, and ice, but if you are intending to recur them with Seidr, why not just play Friends instead? Friends is so much more efficient and so much more reliable because it can be done on your own terms, on your own volition. Whereas operations, you can't recur them with Friends. So Seidr does that for you. That is what you want to. That is your starting point, I would think, when you're building a Seidr deck. Finding key operations that you want to recur. Biotic Labor is a straight up win con that is very reliable against most matchups, and this is why I chose it as the win con for this deck. Another possible operation you can recur is Enhanced Login Protocol. It serves 2 purposes. Firstly, to slow down runners, especially Termusion based runners, but more importantly, to remove Employee Strike from the board. Employee Strike was active for a good portion of this game, and I could have used an Enhanced Login Protocol at some point. Speaking of Employee Strike, I argue that if you're building a Seidr deck, you actually want to enhance the impact of your recursion, the Seidr recursion, rather than try to jam every single click loss trigger in your deck. I don't think a Seidr deck that jams everything like Bellamy, False Lead, Troll, all these minus click cards is of much good. It's the trap that most new players fall into when they build a new deck. They try to put all these fantastic new cards that seem to synergize with each other in the same deck, but realize it just doesn't work so well, and is super vulnerable to hate cards. A single employee strike just kills that deck. Whereas, as you saw in this game, I didn't really care less about employee strike. It changed my gameplay a bit. I was forced to score more aggressively, but other than that, it's not like my entire game is completely switched off just because someone played a strike against me. I can live with strike, and yeah, that's an important mark of a consistent deck. What I chose instead to do is to focus my deck building on making these Seidr triggers count. I don't think I triggered Seidr more than 2 times this game, but every time I triggered it, it mattered. The default recursion is Baltic Labor, as mentioned, but I didn't use it this game at all. Instead, I found myself pretty short on credits, so I ended up recurring Hedge Fund and Violet level clearance for economy, and Violet level later on for massive draw into my winning cards, the Baltic Labors and the ABT that would have eventually won me the game. That was actually rather key, and something that ETF doesn't really do. With the Violet level clearance that I recurred, I basically sped up my game by at least 3 turns. If I were playing ETF at that point without access to the Violet level, I would have been frantically drawing through my deck to find the winning ABT and Vitruvius. That might have given my opponent the time needed to set up the KD Jones, to set up the runs they needed to steal the final agenda from me. So yes, Seidr's amazing. It remains to be seen whether it is comparable to ETF. I am rather hesitant to say so, but Seidr's a very interesting ability, and I think it's really, really well designed. Try it if you haven't, because you can do a lot of things with it. I plan to explore this ID more, and I'll see you the next time when I do so. In the meantime, thanks for watching and happy net running. Bye.